the process of planning for our wedding, we knew that there would be a lot of people there, and mostly young single women lamenting their losses, but truth hurts, doesn't it? Anyway, we wound up with 450 people at our wedding, and when you have that many people at your wedding, you wind up with an absolute mountain of wedding gifts. So after our honeymoon, we came back and began the process of opening these packages and getting the list of names and gifts so that we could write all these thank you notes. And as we're going through all these gifts, we get to this one fairly large package, and it was from Caroline's cousin. And he's known to be a jokester. In fact, kind of takes real pride in pulling pranks on people. And so we were a bit unsure as to what this actually was going to be and whether it was going to be a joke or not. Even after we opened it, we were still unsure whether it was legitimate or if it was a prank. Anyway, we opened this package, and inside there is this picture. And it's not a small picture. It's probably 3 feet long, easily maybe 2.5 feet tall. And it was a landscape. As I recall, it might have had a waterfall and some trees or something like that. It wasn't an ugly picture per se. It wasn't a beautiful picture per se. It was just kind of your ordinary run-of-the-mill landscape. But this wasn't your ordinary photo. This wasn't your ordinary landscape, because attached to it is a plug. And so we go and we plug this picture in, and all of a sudden it becomes backlit with fluorescent lights. And so you can see this now very bright. In addition, all of a sudden you begin to hear the sounds of crickets chirping. Let me just say, if you like pictures like that, I don't have any problem with it whatsoever. If you want to hang it above your bed, or if you want to hang it above the fireplace, wherever you want to have it in your house, that's fine, so long as it's your house. Anyway, so neither of us felt this is going to be something that we want to hang on to, because the picture is just okay, but I don't want to have to plug my pictures in. Besides that, if I want to hear crickets, I'll just go outside at night. I really don't want to hear them inside. After all, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you hear a cricket in your bedroom, don't you want to go step on it? Why buy it and plug it in? That doesn't make any sense. So anyway, because of this experience, when we have an opportunity to encourage or give some advice to couples as they're in the wedding planning stages, this is something that we will encourage them to do. When you go to the stores, whether that's Target, Bed Bath & Beyond, Belk, wherever it is that you go to register for far more things than you would ever think that you would use or actually need. So if you're looking for an 8-piece place setting of dishes, well, put down 12, maybe 16, and here's the reason. If you just put a small amount on there, when people go to find a gift for you for your wedding, when they pull up that registry and everything is already bought, everything's already purchased, you know what they're going to do? They're going to go somewhere else and buy something else, something you may not want. Maybe a picture you plug in. Maybe something that makes crickets chirp. And when you get that, not only will you not want it, you don't want to do with it, you don't know where to take it back. You're stuck with it. And because you're stuck with it, because you don't know where it came from, you can't actually go back to that store, back to the Target, back to the Belk, back to the Bed Bath & Beyond, and trade that in for something that you really want, something that you could really use. This whole idea of trading in, I want you to think with me about for a few minutes this morning. We're coming today to an end of this series that I've been working through in the Gospel of Mark, entitled Time Flies. And today we conclude this series with a message that focuses on someone whose name is synonymous with betrayal. Of course, that person is Judas. What's interesting, though, is that Mark repeatedly uses the word betray or betrayal to describe what Judas is doing. But it's interesting, the word that he uses, it's not accidental. The word that he uses that's translated as betray literally means to surrender to give over to, but it conveys the idea of exchange. What I would submit to you is that Judas was taking Jesus to the return counter, not simply to turn him over or to give him up, but so that he might get something in return. You may not think so at this point, but I believe the simple reality is that there are many today, perhaps more than a few, even in this place, and probably each of us to varying degrees. In essence, we have found ourselves doing what Judas did. That is, that we trade him in for something. Now, to prevent this, we've got to understand how this whole process of trading Jesus in actually works. And we can begin to understand this process when we not only see some questions that this text raises for us, but also how it answers them for us. If you would look with me in your Bibles today first to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14, we're going to start with verse 10 and 11 and then skip down a few verses. Once you have found Mark 14, stick an envelope, your bulletin, stick something there, and then flip over to Matthew 27. So Mark 14 and Matthew 27. Mark 14, verses 10 and 11, and then Matthew chapter 27. All right, we're going to start with Mark 14. Verse 10, we're told, this is again Mark 14, verse 10, "Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. So he sought how he might conveniently betray him." Skip down to verse 43. "And immediately while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude, with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, 'Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely.' As soon as he had come, immediately he went up to Jesus, said to him, 'Rabbi, Rabbi,' and kissed him. Then they laid their hands on him and took him." Now flip back over to Matthew 27. We start with verse 3. We're told, "Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that Jesus had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, 'I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.' And they said, 'What is that to us? You see to it.' Then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself." What we see in this passage, in these various texts, as this story unfolds, we see Judas doing what I spoke about a moment ago, which is in effect taking Jesus to the return counter. And what I said to you earlier on, I still believe to be emphatically true, which is that in essence or in form, so many of us that profess to be followers of Jesus on all too frequent a basis do exactly the same thing. We trade Jesus in. Well, if we can understand how this works, then hopefully we can stop this and prevent it in the future. And we understand it by seeing some questions that these texts raise. And the first is this: what would lead someone to trade Jesus in? What would lead someone to trade Jesus in? Over the past 2.5 years, you've heard me preach a slew of sermons, and almost without exclusion, I always preach just one passage, just one text. And we're looking at 2 different passages and then 2 different books of the Bible, but that's necessary today so that we get the whole story. And again, the question, though, is what would lead someone to trade Jesus in? As we get to verse 10 of chapter 14, this is not only the final week, but now these are the final days of Jesus' earthly life and ministry. And all of his work, all of his ministry is coming to a climax. And as all of these things are occurring, we're told that Judas, one of the 12, so he's one of the disciples, he went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. Now, a couple of things are noteworthy about this. First of all, this was not accidental. It wasn't that Judas just one day happened to run into some of the priests, this conversation began, and things just kind of got out of control. And one thing led to another, said this, said that, and then all of a sudden he's betraying Jesus. No, it says he went to the chief priest. This was not accidental. There was forethought, there was intention, there was planning in this. And not only was it an intentional act as to what he was doing, it was intentional with whom he was doing this. But Judas, why would Judas do such a thing? After all, Judas was part of this group of 12 disciples. And these disciples, Judas among them, think of all the things that they had left behind, that they had forsaken to become some of Jesus' followers, his closest followers, his trusted disciples. Judas, like Matthew, like Peter, like John and the rest, had left the comforts of home, had left everything that was familiar, left their jobs, left everything to go and follow Jesus throughout Galilee. Beyond that, Judas had demonstrated himself as to be someone worthy or implicitly worthy of trust. After all, they had named him to be their treasurer. Why then would Judas give up all of that and commit this act of spiritual treason? Well, that leads us to the broader question, why would anyone trade Jesus in? Well, based on what we see, there's a couple of answers to that one question. And the first is this: to gain pleasure for yourself or others. To gain pleasure for yourself or others. Notice how verse 11 describes this. Judas has gone to the chief priests to betray Jesus, to turn him in. Now, the word that is used there that's translated as betray in Greek is the word paradoi. It literally means to surrender to turn over to. But as I said early on, it conveys the idea of gaining something in exchange. It's not me just simply saying, here, there's my Bible. It's saying, here's my Bible, I'm going to take this table instead. You're getting something in return. And what was Judas getting? What do others get? Well, either the pleasure of themselves or others. Verse 11 says, when they heard it, they were glad. Now again, this was not an accidental decision, an accidental act by Judas. He intentionally was doing this, and it was intentional with whom he was doing this. He knew that these chief priests, they were opposed. They could not stand Jesus. And any possibility to get rid of him, they were going to seize this. So he goes to them, and when they heard this, they were glad. Man, we've been waiting for a chance like this. Judas, we are so glad to see you. So glad to finally hear about an opportunity such as this. They were exceedingly grateful for this. Now, beyond this, not only did they have their pleasure, but Judas gets the pleasure of their pleasure because Judas is viewed by them as special. Judas is viewed by them as someone that is appreciated and valuable to them. So they gain pleasure. Judas gains pleasure through that, but there are even other ways that Judas has gained pleasure. When Judas signed up as one of the followers of Jesus, he, like the rest of the disciples, understood that Jesus was different. There was something special about him. And the disciples came to recognize that Jesus is, in fact, the promised one of God. He is the Messiah. But it seems that Judas had this whole concept of what Messiah actually is all screwed up in his head. Judas believed that the Messiah is the one that was going to come back, and he was going to throw off Roman oppression, and he was going to establish Israel once again in its rightful place as chief among the nations of the world. And as time passes, he begins to get increasingly disillusioned with Jesus because he comes to recognize Jesus is not interested in changing or overthrowing governments. Jesus is not interested in being a change agent in a particular community. He's not a civic crusader. Jesus came not to change communities or governments or municipalities. Jesus was coming to change people in their very hearts. And as time passes, Judas's disillusion grows, and the thought of trading Jesus in for something he would rather have, well, that becomes pleasant to him. Why would someone trade Jesus in to gain pleasure from self or others? But there's one more reason, and that is to get some sort of perceived gain. To get some sort of perceived gain. So again, he's not simply betraying, he's trading Jesus in. He's going to get something for it. Verse 11 says they promised to give him money. We know later it's 30 pieces of silver. Our daughter Catherine is 18 months old, and at this point is very busy, always into something. And something like this occurs on a near daily basis in our house. The boys will have some toy or toys in the den that they have been playing with, and they may be in the act of playing with it. And Catherine notices this. She sees this, and the second they put that toy down, the second their hands leave it, she goes and grabs it, and she heads in the opposite direction because she knows she's taking this from them. Well, the boys have come to recognize if they go then to her and snatch this from her, well, then she's going to start crying and screaming, and she's going to be super mad, and they've decided, I want to avoid that. So instead of going and snatching the toy from her, what they do is to first look around and think, what is it that she may be interested in instead? And so they'll find some other toy and they'll go and say, hey, Cat, don't you, here, look at this, don't you want this? And she looks at this different toy. She decides, yeah, I'd like that. She drops what they had. She takes that, and everybody's happy. Now, at 18 months, Catherine understands this. I'm not going to give up what I have for nothing. I'm going to get something for it. It's exactly that same principle that Judas was operating on. I've got Jesus, I can give him over to you, but I'm going to get something for it. And he was operating under this notion, there is some sort of perceived gain that I can receive. And for him, the gain was 30 pieces of silver. In Exodus 21, we discover that 30 pieces of silver was the going rate, the standard price for a slave. I'm going to sell Jesus for the price of a slave. He traded him in because there was some sort of perceived gain. Now, hearing this, many of you would just say, well, Michael, that's all well and good. This helps me understand everything that took place 2,000 years ago. But this doesn't happen or have any relevance to me in my life and my walk with the Lord. After all, I am not simply committed, I am deeply committed to the Lord. And this type of thing, this type of betrayal, turning Jesus in, that's what Judas did. But I would never do something like that. But the truth is, it happens all the time. At school or at work, we have opportunities to be able to share a word or express a word about Jesus, to stand up for Him, or to share and stand up for biblical truth. And when those opportunities present themselves, all of a sudden we play dumb or mute. And we do so because we don't want other people to look at us with ill and disdain. And so for the perceived gain of the pleasure of others and our own personal sense of egotistical security, we just remain silent about Jesus, trading Him over for the pleasure of others. Well, beyond that, supposedly in the pursuit of following Christ, when we are presented with opportunities to engage in immoral behavior, unfortunately, those inside the church too many times are no different than those outside of the church. And when presented with an opportunity to engage in immoral behavior and to turn our backs on the standards of God and engage what displeases Him, well, we'll trade Him in for moments or seasons of temporary pleasure. We'll engage in business deals and get into things from a financial or economic basis that are absolutely displeasing to the Lord and in violation of His standards. And we know that, but we will do so that we have more money in our pockets. What I'm saying to you is that what Judas did, it's not isolated. Judas does not have a monopoly on betrayal, does not have a monopoly on trading Jesus in, because it happens all the time, even among people in this room. What would lead someone to do it? Well, to get pleasure for themselves or others, to get some sort of perceived gain. There's another question that this text answers for us, which is this: what circumstances are present when we trade Jesus in? What circumstances are present when we trade Jesus in? All of these events do not transpire in a vacuum. There were mindsets, there were mentalities that were present that lined up in such a way to make it possible for Judas to do what he did. And what Judas did, in essence, many are doing today. And what was true in his mind, in the minds of so many today, it's still true. What are those thoughts? Well, when or what circumstances are present to make trading Jesus in likely or possible? And first of all, when we believe our actions have the least risk. When we believe our actions have the least risk. All right, so Judas has gone to betray Jesus. He's negotiated the deal. He's going to get some money. And the deal very simply was this: I'll identify him to you at a particular time, at a particular designated place. You'll know who he is because I'll kiss him on the cheek. And in doing so, I will be able to keep this money that you have provided for me. But notice how verse 11 ends. After he's negotiated this deal, it says he sought how he might conveniently betray him. How he might conveniently betray him. The word that's translated there as conveniently in Greek is a compound word. It is eukairos. Eu is a prefix meaning good. Kairos means time. He thought what a good time would be for him to do this. Well, what would be a good time for Judas to betray Jesus, to trade him in? Well, how about when there's hundreds or thousands of people in the crowd waiting to see Jesus do another miracle? Maybe it is while he's teaching and hundreds of people are gathered, all of these supporters and the rest of the disciples right in front of him. Is that a good time? No. Well, how about at high noon out in front of the temple, out on the steps of the temple in the outer courtyard? That would be a great time to do this, to trade Jesus in to the chief priest. No. That would be a lousy time. Because Judas recognized, if I were to do something like that, well, there's a lot of people that are still supporters of Jesus, still deeply committed to following him. And if I do this in front of them, they may have my hide. I may be physically assaulted. They may take me out and stone me. I could lose my life. At the very least, I would become a pariah in my own community. And so when thinking what a good time, a eukairos was, Judas thought, I got to do this not during the day. Nighttime is the best. Not in front of crowds of people, but when everybody else is busy. And so when did he choose? Passover night. And on Passover night, everybody in Jerusalem would have been at their particular home with their family, their closest of friends, observing the Passover meal. Beyond that, not only are all these people occupied, he's going to do so away from the city, out in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's dark out there. There's no street lights. People will be oblivious to this. There'll only be just a very few disciples. It'll be late in the evening. That will be the best time. The best time when he would have as little risk of exposure, humiliation, or loss. Again, this didn't happen in a vacuum. In a vacuum, it occurred when he assessed the moment or the time of least possible risk. Well, the truth is that happens today, still among us today. Let me give you just a very quick example. I would say that there have probably been, in fact, I believe I could say this with certainty, among the people in this room, there have been more than a few bad words said just this past week. You know who you are. You hit your thumb with a hammer, you said, behold, right? All right, so I don't know how many it is. I can't even guess. But I am sure there have been more than a few foul, curse words that have been uttered by those in this room just this past week. As certain as I am of that fact, I'm also certain of this fact. You didn't say them last Sunday in Sunday school. You didn't say them last Sunday or this morning when we were shaking hands with each other. Good morning, you so-and-so. You didn't say that, did you? I don't like that blankety-blank song. You didn't say that, did you? Why did we not do that? Well, we used those words when we were as far removed from those that we know are the followers of Jesus. We don't want them to know what we're doing. We don't want them to hear what we're saying because of the risk of exposure and the risk of humiliation. Listen, when you and I turn our backs on Jesus and trade Him in for whatever it is, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens at a time and in a circumstance when we have assessed the risk and determined the opportune time that is the least risky or exposes us to the least amount of possible loss. But there's another circumstance present when we trade Jesus in, and that's when we feel that we can determine the consequences. When we feel like we can determine the consequences. If you flip over to Matthew 27, we get the rest of the story where we're told Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful. Between what we read in Mark 14 and what we read here in Matthew 27, Jesus has been identified by this kiss of betrayal there in the garden. Jesus has been arrested, has already been through a series of sham trials, and ultimately before Pilate, who ultimately imposes and pronounces the sentence of death. Jesus has now been condemned to die, not simply by execution, but execution in the form of crucifixion, the most horrible way that someone in that day could have been executed. Well, Judas hears this, and it says, seeing that he had been condemned, he was remorseful. Now, Judas was not just remorseful on his own. It's because of these circumstances. And in Judas's mind, this should not have happened this way. As Judas was in the process and the act of planning all this out and thinking all this through, he thought, you know what? This whole idea of following Jesus, it's not what I originally signed up for. I expected him to do A, he wound up doing B and C. Not interested in that. I want out of this, but I want to get something for it. And so if I turn Jesus over to those that hate him, that despise him, well, maybe Jesus might get roughed up a little bit. Maybe he'll spend a few nights in jail. It'll be kind of inconvenient for him, but at the end of the day, it'll be an inconvenience for Jesus, and I'm going to wind up with some money in my pocket to get a fresh start, because I've lost my job 3 years ago. So this will help me start a new chapter in my life, and just the most modest of inconvenience to Jesus. But things didn't unfold that way. Jesus has not simply been arrested, but he's been condemned to die. And Judas thinks that's not how this was supposed to happen. Now, how it was to happen is that Jesus gets arrested. He gets roughed up a little bit. He spends a night or two or a week or a month or whatever it is. He'll spend that in jail, but he's kind of like a cat. He'll land on his feet and we'll all be okay a year from now. But now Jesus is sentenced to die. Judas's betrayal occurred in the circumstance and in the environment where Judas operated on this premise. I not only can choose what I do, I can determine and choose what the consequences are. I can do what I choose and also choose what the consequences are. I want you to understand me very clearly in this. Not simply as people, but in particular as Americans, we are amazingly free. And we're free to make all sorts of decisions, oftentimes about inconsequential things. I mean, you're free to decide after church is over what you're going to eat, where you're going to eat, whether you eat at home, whether you eat at a restaurant, whether you eat fast food, or you eat at a sit-down restaurant. You're free to decide how late you stay up tonight, whether you watch TV or whether you don't. I mean, all sorts of insignificant things we're free to choose about. We're also free to choose about consequential things, about whether we're going to get married, who we're going to marry, what type of work we'll do, who we'll actually work for. These are our consequential decisions. But beyond that, we have the ability to choose what it is that we believe to be true, what convictions and moral standards we're going to maintain, and what convictions we will absolutely stand and fight for. We are completely free to make all of those decisions. You are completely free to make all of those decisions. But hear me in this. You are absolutely not free, completely not free to determine the consequences of a single of those decisions. You're free to make your choices, but never free to determine the consequences. And about the time that you think, not only can I decide what I do, I can determine the results for it, hear me in this. You are in line taking Jesus to the return counter, trading him in on something because you think in your mind, this is all the consequence is going to be. There's a final question that all this passage answers for us. What are the results of it? What are the results of trading Jesus in? We've seen what the motivation was. We've seen the environment and the circumstances that brought it to bear, but what are the consequences? Not simply for Judas, but the consequences for us. Well, the first thing that happens is that we will experience regret. We will experience regret. You see that so very clearly in the Matthew passage. Seeing what he has done, Judas recognizes Jesus is getting ready to die on a cross, and I have betrayed him. I have turned my back on him who is innocent. And we're told in verse 3 of Matthew 27, seeing all of this, he was remorseful. Remorseful. The word that Matthew uses there literally means to regret or wish something was undone. I really believe in Judas's mind at this point, he thought back on the day that he negotiated this deal, I wish I'd not even woken up that morning. It would have been better for me to have just died in my sleep, and none of this would have ever happened. I so regret, I am so remorseful, I just wish somehow this were undone. So the first thing that we experience is what he experienced. We experience regret. We experience remorse. But then there's a second thing that we do. We try to undo the damage. We try to undo the damage. So once he has experienced this remorse, hearing that Jesus has been condemned, he takes the money. He takes these 30 pieces back of silver and he takes them to the chief priests and elders. In verse 4 of Matthew 27, he says, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. I shouldn't have done this. I made a colossal mistake. Please, here, take your money back. Let's see if somehow we can undo this. Let's take all these actions back. Let's reverse the clock. Let's undo what has been done. They respond at the end of verse 4, what is that to us? We don't want your stinking money. I don't know if you saw the sign up on the wall. No returns, no refunds, no exchanges. They're saying to him, what is done is done. A number of years ago, back before I met Caroline and I was living by myself, of course, if I were to eat at home, that would be because I cooked it. And one particular night, I decided I want to make some chili, like for hot dogs or hamburgers. And there was this little joint in Charlotte that was kind of known for their chili. And I didn't know all the ingredients that were in their recipe, but I knew there were two particular spices. There was a lot of two particular spices. First of all, they had a lot of black pepper in their chili, and they had a lot of chili powder in it. It wasn't like hot or anything, but just had a really bold flavor, and you could tell there was a lot of both black pepper and chili powder in their chili. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to see to the best extent I can to make some chili that hopefully will taste like that of Brooks Brothers. So I get the ground beef and I brown this, and so I'm ready now to make the chili. I put it in a pot. I add some ketchup first as a little bit of base. I add a little bit of water, and I reach in the cabinet. I grab the black powder and I grab the chili powder. And again, I knew that Brooks Sandwich House, their chili has a lot of both chili powder and black pepper in it, so I'm really sticking the chili powder to it. I'm really sticking the black pepper to it. All is well and good, and I get this to a point where I think this is about right, but I need to let it simmer and kind of stew for a little bit so that these spices are doing their work and permeating their flavor throughout the course of this meat. And so I came back a short time later, and I got a spoon. I was going to taste this to see if I need to add any more of anything else. And I get a spoon, I drain off a little bit of this juice or grease, and I put it in my mouth, and the second I did so, I felt as though I had taken a bite of hell itself. And all of a sudden, I'm thinking, how did this happen? I mean, black pepper, it's a strong flavor, but it's not that hot. Chili powder it's just not that hot. I mean, it's got clearly some spice to it, but it's just not inferno hot. I mean, what I was eating was scalding, nuclear hot. And so then I look on the cabinet to investigate my spices. I see the black pepper there. And then what I thought I had grabbed was chili powder was a big old thing of cayenne pepper. And I had just loaded that chili with cayenne pepper. Like Judas, I was remorseful. I regretted what I had done. Beyond that, I wanted to undo the damage. And you know what? You can't get cayenne pepper back out of chili. But you know what? You can't undo trading Jesus in. Listen, what has been done is done. Judas, recognizing this, we're told in verse 6, at the end of verse 5, feeling all is lost, Judas departed, he went out, he hung himself. That's it. I can't fix this. I can't undo what's been done. Jesus is going to die on the cross. It's my fault, and I can't change that. So is that where I leave you today? You screw up, you can't fix it. What's done is done. Go find the next tree. Get you some rope. Call it quits. Is that what I'm saying to you? Emphatically not. Hear me in this. On the night that Judas was doing all of this, there was another disciple of Jesus that we know as Peter. And Peter, fulfilling a prediction that Jesus had made, was given not one, not two, but 3 opportunities to identify himself as a follower of Jesus. And what does Peter do? Not once, not twice, but 3 times in the span of one night, just a period of hours, says, "What you talking about, Willis? I don't know who he is. No, I'm not one of his followers. Are you crazy? You lost your mind? No, I'm not with I wasn't one of his followers. No, not me, not Jesus." Now, what we do, though, is we call what Peter did, that he was denying Jesus. What I would say to you, though, is that he, in essence, is doing the same thing that Judas was doing. He was trading Jesus in. For Peter, what was he trading him in for? For personal security. Once Peter saw that Jesus had been arrested, Jesus may very well lose his life. Peter's scared for his own skin. He's frightened, he's afraid, and decides, yeah, here's Jesus. Give me my personal security. Likewise, Peter was remorseful afterwards. Mark tells us that Peter wept bitterly, wishing all of this was undone. But Peter knew, as Judas knew what we know. What has occurred has occurred. We can't undo past action. What was all lost for Peter? No, it wasn't. Because he came back to Jesus. He came back to Jesus, and you know what he did? He traded his personal security to get Jesus. He decided, you know what? Whatever happens to me, it's going to be in the Lord's hands, but I know who He is, and I'm going to follow Him no matter what the cost. I want to know Him, to walk with Him, to be used by Him. And God used Peter to amazing and to colossal effect. In this series of messages, we have been talking about how, like Jesus, we've got a limited amount of time here on this earth. Jesus had a public ministry spanning just 3 short years. And that time for Jesus, like our time, it just flies by. And we've talked about and noted how if we want to be serious as one of His followers, we've got to do things like Him, which is to seize and fulfill every purpose for which the Father has for us. But understand this, those purposes will never be fulfilled, and God will never use you in significant ways so long as you're trading Jesus in for anything. The pleasure of yourself or others, to get some more money in your pocket so that people don't look down their nose at you, just so that you can do whatever you want without any interference from the Lord or from His standards. So long as you're trading Him in on anything, time is going to fly, and so too is opportunity. And what's lost will not be able to be regained. Listen, if you have been like Judas, like Peter, like me, like so many others in this room, and have been, or maybe even now, are in the act of trading Jesus in for something, taking Him to the return counter, will you come back to Him? Will you forsake that to get Him back? Don't delay, because time, it flies. Pray with me.